Emergency Management Commissioner. I'm joined this afternoon by Christy Johnson from the Bureau of Meteorology and Tim Weebush, the Chief Officer of the State Emergency Service. We stood up here late last week with the Bureau and again with Tim, where there was a forecast that we would see significant rainfall across the state. And that's exactly what we've seen over the last 24 hours, 36 hours. And Christy will go into more detail in relation to some of those rainfall totals and where we saw the more significant impacts. What we did also see was more than 650 requests for assistance that went to the State Emergency Service. A lot of those were down in the Mornington Peninsula, in that particular area where we had a warning in relation to severe weather. What we did also see as part of those requests for assistance was a number of requests for people to be rescued in and around floodwaters. Yet another reminder about the dangers of driving into, of being in and around floodwater when you don't need to be. But Tim will go into a lot more detail in relation to where we saw those requests for assistance. Whilst we have seen some impacts in relation to river systems that have already resulted in flooding, we know that we will not see those river levels at what we saw sort of that 5 weeks ago, where we saw many communities impacted across the state as a whole. But as I mentioned, Tim will go into a bit more detail about what this rainfall means in relation to those particular rain systems. What we did see, though, also at about 5:30 this morning near Inverleigh, near Geelong, was the fact we saw it was a 1.7 kilometre train with about 55 carriages. 16 of those carriages derailed down in that Inverleigh area. Fortunately, and we have been advised that there was no one injured as a result of that particular derailment. We know that the Australian Transport Safety Bureau is on scene and is undertaking an investigation in relation to what caused the derailment itself. We don't have any further details at this particular point in time, and we'll let the ATSB undergo their investigation. I'll now hand to Christy. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Christy Johnson from the Bureau of Meteorology. So yesterday afternoon we saw showers and thunderstorms developing over the northeast of the state, and that continued into the evening and part of the overnight period. At the same time, in the afternoon and evening, or late afternoon and evening, we saw thunderstorms developing in the west of the state, and those moved very slowly across the west, reaching the central districts in the overnight period and then clearing into the east of the state during the early hours of today. So with that system that came in from the west, we did see some severe thunderstorms with that, and we did have warnings issued for parts of the southwest district, the central district, and in particular we saw some severe storms in a line of storms that intensified as it moved over the bay and over the Mornington Peninsula and affecting that area around Hastings and across the Mornington Peninsula. So we did see flash flooding or heavy rainfall that did lead to flash flooding in those storms over the southwest and the central district. We also saw rainfall totals in the northeast tick up over the course of the last 24 to 36 hours, and we have seen 100 to 150 millimetres up there. So at the moment, the highest rainfall for this system is about 147 millimetres at Mount Hotham, but we've also seen a number of places get up over 100 millimetres in that area. So what's going to happen from now on? We do have that system has moved away, and we have a cold southwesterly airflow behind it with the coldest air moving in. So we're going to see showers across most of the state today. There are some thunderstorms through the north. Those are more isolated than what we saw yesterday and not expected to be severe. And we will see those showers continue probably tomorrow, more so contracting to on and south of the ranges, but very cold air moving up. So we will see the snow level drop from perhaps tonight, certainly into tomorrow, perhaps down as low as 800 metres above sea level. Could see snow so up on the alpine peaks. And we could also see some small hail with some of those showers in that very cold air. So a real cold outbreak coming tomorrow. That will continue on Wednesday, where we will see the snow level above about 1,000 metres. And then that will continue to move away. The showers will start to ease later on Wednesday, looking at fairly settled weather through Thursday and Friday. and then potentially another system developing on the weekend. So this looks like moving into the state, this next system on Saturday afternoon, and then affecting central and eastern parts on Sunday. But the good news is at this stage we're looking at rainfall totals mostly around 20 to 40 millimetres on Sunday through the northeast, maybe isolated falls of 50 millimetres with thunderstorms, but nothing like the 100 to 150 millimetres that we saw over the last 24 to 36 hours. And now I'll hand over to Tim. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. As we've talked about a number of times, this flood emergency is still far from over, and we've currently got 85 warnings that are live in Victoria right at this time. Around a dozen of those are at the watch and act level, and they're the ones that we particularly want people to pay attention to make sure that they are doing exactly what that warning says, monitoring their local conditions and being prepared to act. And that's because as a result of the heavy rainfall that we have seen in the last 24 hours, we are now starting to see our river systems respond. However, overnight we saw flash flooding, as you've heard, across a range of locations in Victoria. In particular, we saw at Mount Martha through to Mornington, all the way across to Hastings, around 300 requests for assistance as a result of flash flooding through a storm cell that went through there, leaving between 40 to 50 millimetres of rain in just a couple of hours. SES volunteers and other emergency services are still in the area assessing those impacts and still responding to around about 80 requests for assistance. We do know that there are 7 homes in the Balnarring area that have been flooded above the floor level and will have families relocated from them. In the southwest of the state, we saw at Lethbridge another 6 homes that were impacted by flash flooding as a result of storm activity overnight. On the Hume Freeway, we saw flash flooding see overland flows impact on the northbound lanes between Benalla and Chiltern overnight, but that road has now been reopened. We've also seen a range of roads that remain closed in the north of the state. In fact, there are almost 450 roads that are closed at this time, and in particular the Murray Valley Highway between Barnawatha and Rutherglen is currently closed as well. Across the state, we're now starting to see a range of our river systems reach the major flood levels. So we have the Murray at major flood level in various areas, and I'll speak to that more specifically in a moment, along with the Kiewa River at Dockers Road that is now at the major flood level. We also have a range of rivers that are at the moderate flood level. So the Barwon River is starting to reach the moderate level now and is likely to peak at Geelong overnight tonight. We've already seen the peak on Mount Emu Creek at Skipton, where that reached moderate flood levels earlier on today. The Ovens and the Kings rivers, where they come together at Wangaratta, is likely to see a peak between 12.5 and 12.6 metres sometime in the next 24 to 36 hours. And the Werribee River at Balan and also at Melton Reservoir is currently peaking at that moderate flood level. So again, we're asking all Victorians to stay attuned to their emergency broadcasters. Make sure you're checking in on the Vic Emergency app for those rivers that are currently starting to reach various peak levels. But for our Murray River communities, there's still some time to go with the flooding that's occurring. As you've heard, overnight we saw major flooding occur at Albury-Wodonga. That's now receded slightly to being just below the major flood level. However, that floodwater is now heading downstream towards Yarrawonga, where we're expecting to see a major flood peak sometime from Thursday onwards. Then it'll also head downstream further to Tocumwal, where we're likely to see major flooding into the weekend. At Echuca, we're still seeing major flood levels, and that's because of renewed rises on some of the other river systems and locally heavy rainfall that's coming into that system from stormwater systems and the like. And then as we head from Swan Hill through to the South Australia border, we're now likely to see peaks at Warkle Junction in the next 24 hours at levels that are equivalent to what we saw in 1975. The Murray River at Robinvale is then the next area of concern, where we're likely to see major flooding from the 17th of November before reaching 10.4 metres on the 21st of November. And then finally on the Murray River as it comes into Mildura, we're likely to see it exceed the major flood level on the 26th of November before it will then reach a peak of 38.6 metres in early December. So again, still some time to go before this flood emergency is over in Victoria. We're happy to take any questions you might have.
You mentioned 650 calls to the SES. Was that across the state or was that for a specific time period in place?
The 650 requests for assistance was statewide, and in particular from overnight last night through today, and around 300 of those were on the Mornington Peninsula.
Tim, I know that it was mentioned that the derailment is currently being investigated, but how likely is it that floods did play some sort of role or play a major role in that?
Look, it's still too early to know the exact cause. As the Commissioners mentioned, investigations are underway. We do know that there was heavy rainfall and some flash flooding in that area, but at this stage it's still too early to know what the cause was of that train derailment.
The pictures of the derailment are pretty dramatic. How lucky are we that it wasn't potentially worse?
Look, we're incredibly lucky that we weren't dealing with a passenger train in this instance, and that the crews that were on board that freight train were also came out of that event unscathed. So very fortunate overnight not to have seen something more serious in and around Inverleigh.
And how long is it going to take to fix?
Look, the early indications from the rail authorities is it's going to take some time. They're still assessing how they can get heavy machinery in there to remove the wreckage, but also to be able to reinstate the line. So it could be a week or more before we're starting to see active work on that line.
I guess what's the implications of that if it takes longer to get machinery in there? What impact will that have on movements of stuff around the state?
Look, at this stage, the Australian Rail Corporation is indicating that it will have some impacts to freight movements across Victoria and in particular on that line, but alternative arrangements are being put into place for freight movements in the meantime.
Just back to the flooding, particularly we saw around Mornington Peninsula, areas like Safety Beach. I know one of the concerns from residents there, they were saying the water was actually coming up through drains. Can you talk me through any of the issues you're aware of there in terms of drainage and how that plays in when we have this sort of rainfall event?
Look, when we see these flash flood events, our stormwater systems quite quickly become overwhelmed, and we can actually see what we call back surge occurring in those areas. And so it may be that whilst the heavy rainfall is going into the storm water system in one location, it can then, come out in another location where it's finding that lower point. So some of the flash flooding that we will have seen in the last 24 hours will have been as a result of that phenomena occurring.
More broadly speaking, the kinds of areas where we're seeing this flash flooding, I mean, are these areas that you're used to dealing with this, or is it a surprise that we're seeing this sort of, it feels like we've had so much flash flooding recently. Is there actually an increase at the moment, and maybe that's one for Christy as well?
Look, we've obviously been experiencing the effects of La Nina and the negative Indian Ocean dipole that have been bringing above average rainfall to Victoria. We know in October we saw the wettest October on record, and that resulted in the most requests for assistance on record for SES and its volunteers. So it's probably no surprise that when we see these storm systems that are coming through that are associated with that tropical moisture, that we see heavy downpours that very quickly overwhelm some of our stormwater systems.
You mentioned the impact of the train derailment on freight, and also part of the Hume was cut off this morning. How is this flooding event impacting our connectivity with other states?
Yeah, and again, our Department of Transport are doing an incredible job to reopen roads as best they can under very trying circumstances. So again, whilst northbound was closed on the Hume for a short period of time, it has been opened up, albeit at reduced speed. So we'll continue with the Department of Transport to do whatever we can to ensure that that we maintain that connection with our neighbours interstate. But you don't go through such a significant impact. Events such as what we've seen in Victoria and New South Wales without there being some impacts in relation to movement of freight, of goods, of people. But so many people doing such an incredible job to make sure that we're opening up roads, we're opening up rail and other ways of moving freight around as quickly as we can.
One for Christy. Are you able to talk us through some of the rainfall and activity in Inverleigh, that Bannockburn area where this derailment's happened?
Yeah, so we did have that line of storms that I mentioned earlier move through that area. overnight, and we saw at Inverleigh about 20 millimetres fell in about 3 hours. So that doesn't actually break any thresholds for warning for what the Bureau issues, but it is quite a lot of rainfall in a short period of time. And nearby at Warrenbine, we did actually see 50 millimetres in 6 hours, which is quite heavy as well. So those were the sort of rainfall totals that we saw in that area overnight as that storm line moved through.
Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, guys.